Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about post-colonial literary criticism. Now, post-colonialism, as the prefix might imply, follows after the colonial period. So, colonialism in the context of post-colonial theory tends to refer to the European colonization of the Americas, of Africa, of Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, these general areas, the Middle East, these general areas, though it can also refer to places like Ireland and even Eastern Europe in the context of Russian or Soviet imperialism. So, post-colonialism is largely focused on what it means for newly liberated nations to emerge from being colonized. Now, there's a lot of different concerns involved in this, but for me, the big two really are the big two perspectives really are kind of embodied by the philosophy of Frantz Fanon and Homi Bhabha. Now, Frantz Fanon gives, in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, he gives the perspective that colonialism is fundamentally built on conflict. So this comes out of the Marxist literary criticism approach, the idea of social conflict theory. Fanon argues that the settler and the native, which are the terms that he uses, are mutually constituted by violent conflict. That is, the settler particularly does not come to exist as a settler. The colonizer does not come to exist as a colonizer until they are in conflict with the native. And the native does not come to exist as a native until the colonizer arrives. So, prior to colonial contact, the native was not a native in the sense that that's a relative term, right? There's native versus colonizer in this scheme. This Manichaean scheme is what Frantz Fanon calls it. This idea of a binary opposition, two forces that are mutually exclusive and that must encounter each other with violence. The argument essentially is that the settlers' act of domination over the land and the people of a particular area is inherently a violent act. And the native comes to exist as a native as opposed to just a person in the context of that violent experience. And so each side is constituted by violence, and violence is the only way that they can actually engage with one another. On the other side, the other broad perspective, I think, is best explained by Homi Bhabha, who has a theory of cultural hybridity, which is essentially this idea that with colonial contact, each culture is altered. Each culture is fundamentally changed in some way by this contact. And so the challenge for post-colonial nations, for nations that have acquired their independence, is what do you do with that contact? There are some post-colonial intellectuals, particularly in the years very soon after the sort of wave of national liberations in the late 50s through the early 70s. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were some intellectuals, post-colonial intellectuals, who believed that post-colonial nations like Kenya, for instance, or Nigeria, or Burma, Myanmar today, that these nations should attempt to go back to their pre-contact cultures, that they should reject European culture, European influence, European education, etc., etc. We can still see this, actually, variations on this, particularly in some Islamic theocratic states. The idea of eliminating Western influence does still remain in some post-colonial contexts, but the reality is it's simply not practical to do it, particularly in a globalized economy where every nation is interconnected with every other nation. And so what Homi Bhabha points out, first off, is that you can't go back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, you can't unring the bell, whatever it is. And so what post-colonial nations need to try and do is navigate how they establish new cultural modes that combine the best of indigenous traditions with the best of European or colonizer traditions. So how can you bring these things together to make the new culture, the new nation, the new society as productive as possible? This is the central question at the heart of the hybridity model of post-colonial theory. Now, whether or not these two models are actually mutually exclusive is something of an open question, because there is a way to square the idea that colonialism as such is built on an inherently violent relationship with the idea that regardless of how much violence was involved in colonialism, you can't undo that cultural contact and those cultural blendings. You can only learn to navigate them. But these are some of the big ideas undergirding post-colonial theory. Another big thing is language, the role of language in establishing identity, particularly. Because in colonies, European nations or colonial nations tended to impose their own languages, which is why in countries like India or Jamaica or Nigeria, English is a very widely spoken language. It's a language that tends to transcend more localized languages. Like India has tons of local languages. Sure, there's some big dialects like Hindi that are widely spoken, but there's also a lot of other languages where people can't necessarily talk to one another well. Like, there isn't a universal Indian language. The same thing in countries like the Republic of South Africa, where there are 11 national languages and dozens, maybe hundreds of local dialects. English serves as a kind of lingua franca. That is a language that because it was imposed by the colonial system and because business was done in that colonial system in English, a lot of people generally understand it and can speak it at least at a basic level. And so, to some degree, the colonial languages, English, French, Dutch, whatever it is, become a useful tool for communicating across linguistic boundaries within a country. But it also puts the emphasis back on the centrality of that colonial experience in defining the nation's identity. And so there are a good number of post-colonial theorists who actually argue for eliminating colonial languages from liberated nations. Engi Wattiango is one of the main advocates for this. His book, Decolonizing the Mind, makes the argument that he's from Kenya. He grew up in the British colonial education system in Kenya. And he makes the argument basically that the English language and English literature and culture were imposed in the colonial system, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, in order to destroy indigenous cultures. It's what he calls a cultural bomb. And so Ngugi actually both advocates for and has gone back to writing in his native language, Gikuyu, which is one of the languages of Kenya. So that becomes a way of resisting colonial domination of the mind, of the way that colonized peoples think about themselves and express themselves. It becomes a way of resisting that cultural violence. It also becomes a way of reasserting the value of his own culture. We have some variations on this, for instance, in the Caribbean, where we have a lot of Caribbean poets like Louise Bennett, like Claude McKay, like Dorothea Smart, Shara McCallum, Grace Nichols, people like this, who write in part or in whole in Patois or Creole languages. Again, these are ways of legitimizing Caribbean cultures, Caribbean languages, and therefore legitimizing Caribbean people and the way that they experience the world without specifically making reference to the colonial center. So this is really what post-colonialism is primarily concerned with, is how post-colonial nations and authors and people navigate that experience of having been colonized and now being freed or liberated from that colonialism. One of the limitations of some post-colonial theory is that it can sometimes ignore different vectors or different components of experience in order to make sort of broad blanket generalizations. And there are post-colonialists who work against this. So a lot of post-colonial theory, particularly by male post-colonial theorists, ignores the distinctions between the experience of women under colonialism and the experience of men under colonialism. But then you have people like Gayatri Spivak, who come along and say, actually, post-colonial feminism, the experience of women is quite different under colonial systems than the experience of men, because we have these vectors not only of colonialism or racism, but also of gender. And Western feminism white feminism in the US and Europe and things like this is also insufficient to really understand the experience of women in colonial systems, because it lacks the vector of racial and colonial oppression. Similarly, you look at cultures like India or the Igbo in Nigeria, where you have caste systems. There's a tendency in some post-colonial theory to ignore social class. Now, there's social class in every society. I mean, even societies or cultures that don't overtly have a caste system, there's still social class, and that's very important. There is sometimes a tendency to treat post-colonial peoples as homogenous groups. But I would say there's also, even from the earliest post-colonial theory, Frantz Fanon writing in the 60s, for instance, already was making distinctions between colonial intellectuals who he argued would take control of liberated nations and basically serve as puppets of the old colonial rulers, versus the people, sort of broadly conceived in this somewhat Marxist sense of workers and peasants, etc., etc. So again, there's some post-colonial theory. There's some post-colonial theory in which colonized people or formerly colonized people are treated somewhat homogenously, but there's also it would be wrong to say that that's the norm.